All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today on the topic of ISO 55000 overview of asset management. My name is Bhanu Srilla, and I work as Director of Technical Marketing at Grace Engineered Products. And as for my background, I have electrical engineering background and also manufacturing systems and technology management. I also serve in UL Standards Technical Panel for UL 1436 standards and also 61010 standards and 508A for industrial control panels as well. I'm also a certified maintenance and reliability professional from SMRP and also electrical safety and compliance professional from NFPA and also a certified reliability leader as well. Let's go to the next slide. So for the topic of agenda, or basically the asset management standards, we'll talk about the ISO 55000 series standards, which is the 55000, 55001, and also 55002. We'll touch on the key terms, and the terms, those are relating to the assets itself when we talk about the asset management. We'll also have a overview of the asset management, the framework, and also we'll look into the activities in the asset management when we perform those tasks. And lastly, we'll define the benefits of the asset management when you try to implement those international standards. And lastly, we'll also bring attention to the industrial assets as they're applied in mostly industrial environments like motors, pumps, switchgear, transformers, and also generators, etc. So lastly, we'll talk a very brief about the GraceSense predictive maintenance system or our industrial Internet of Things solution, and then we'll take the questions at the end. Okay. So ISO 55000 series standards basically comprise of three different things, as I talked about. The 55000 gives the overview, the principles, and the terminology, because you need to be aware of the terminology and the key terms before you go and apply these standards. And the next one is the 55001, which is basically the requirements as it pertains to the asset management. And then the 55002, which provides the guidelines and the framework of the application of the 55001. So just as a background, so a PAS 55 2008 version, which is a publicly available specification, which is part of the British Standards Institute, that was published version in 2004, and then the revision was done in 2008. And also Institute of Asset Management Professionals body, which gave a document which is 55000 series, which was primarily published in 2014, which is the first edition. And then the 55001 and 55000 itself are from 2014. The 2018, which is more like the application or the guidelines for the application of 55001, which was published in its second edition in 2018. It's about 84 pages document. So why this standards and what's the purpose of the standards, right? So basically the 55000 document provides the common practices and also the framework which can be applied in the broadest range of assets to the different types of organizations, big and small, and also the various types of organizational cultures as well. Okay, so it could be a sector specific, asset specific, and also it could be the activities, those have the technical requirements as far as those assets as well. So why is this used? The three prime reasons why this is used are: one, to improve the realization value of the assets. When you put this asset, you're not talking about the asset, what you do with the asset. It's more like how do you get the max benefit out of any asset you deploy in your plant or a facility. Okay, and the next one is the planning and design and implementation for asset management activities. This is primarily even after you start deploying these assets, what type of the activities you need to perform, which is defined as part of this asset management standards for maintenance activities, and also to make sure the equipment are up and reliable and it's yielding the throughput. Okay, and last but not least, it also provides the how to establish, implement, and maintain, right? So not only you provide these guidelines of implementation, you also need to go back and look at how do you go and maintain this equipment and also to improve on this based on your historical data as well. Okay. So let's take a quick look at what are the key terms in the asset management. Because as I mentioned, you need to understand what this basic definitions of this asset management before you dive in. So what is an asset? Okay, an asset is an item or a thing which has a potential or actual value to the organization. So anything that yields an output or has a potential value of yielding something is considered an asset, right? So however, you have to understand the value of what it yields varies different, right, by the organizations and the stakeholders' expectations are. And it could be a tangible or intangible, or other words, it could be financial or non-financial as well. If you take the output from a facility, it could be a product which is tangible. If it is from any service industry, it could be a service as well, right? The asset can give both the things. One is a product or a service as well. Okay. So the next one is, what is the asset life? The asset life is basically the period from creation through the asset's end life. So once you start putting this asset in place, like the deployment, from it goes through the 4 different stages, which we look at the next one, and through the end of the life cycle. An asset's life does not necessarily coincide with the period or with an organization, and it can extend beyond it. So for example, you can have an asset that's deployed at X facility, but maybe during the middle of the cycle, it could be transported to a different facility where this life could start again. So when we talk about this asset life, it is not just at that one facility. It could take over and go to the next facility and then start over as well. So asset life cycle is the next one, which predominantly talks about the different stages, the various stages involved in the management of that specific piece of asset, right? And then asset management is a coordinated activities to realize the value of the asset. A great example would be a motor or a pump. When you try to put this in work, so you have the design guys who design the system, and then you have the commission guys who will go and perform the commission work, and then it goes through the maintenance cycle, right? So which basically people go and perform the preventive maintenance or the predictive maintenance or run to fail operations, and then it goes through the end of the cycle, right? The asset management basically provides that framework where it is a coordinated activities, not the activities done in a silo. I would like to emphasize these are the activities. We call it a coordinated measure, not an individual itself. Okay, and the asset management system for assets, where it provides the function to establish the policy of the assets. So what are those policies or the guidelines that takes the effect for the managing those assets? And the next one on the list is asset portfolio, which is grouping of this assets based on the type or based on the function or the performance as well. You can have different types of assets. You have a substation where you have the different classifications, like you have the transformers, you have the switch gears, you have the motor control centers, or you have the capacitors and such. For the industrial plant, maybe inside the facility you have these pumps and motors, you have the compressors, various group of assets. You can group them and make it as an asset portfolio, where not only you have this grouping built on that facility level, but you can also group them based on the various facilities on the category as well. Like for example, you put all the pumps in one bucket, then you put all the transformers in one bucket, depends on the different facilities. You can just have a portfolio based on that as well. Okay. So the other terms are a critical asset. So I've highlighted 3 things here in red, which we'll talk in detail, which is a critical asset, a predictive action, and preventive action. Let's take a look at the critical asset, what it is. Any asset that has a significant high potential, which will impact the overall organizational objectives, which is called the critical asset. And then the failure is basically loss of function. So when you can't get anything out from that piece of equipment or an asset, you call it's a failure mode, right? And then the leadership is not directly connected to the asset management itself. It's more like a term which we'll use because more so for any organization to implement these standards, they need to have some level of authority or responsibility to lead ahead, okay, which is what the leadership gives, right? And then the policy, the next one, which is a formally expressed intentions of the top management. So the leadership group defines the policy, which gives the decision makers an authority to implement the systems. And the predictive actions or the actions which monitors the condition of an equipment, right? So predictive, here we're referring to anything that monitors the condition of an asset and predicts the need for a corrective action or a preventative measure. Okay, and the preventive action, on the other hand, is an action which we use to eliminate a potential of nonconformity or an undesirable situation. In this case, preventive functions could be more like a scheduled maintenance function that you do like once in 6 months or once in 3 years to make sure systems are performing to their rated application, right? And then the next one is a process here. It is, again, the interrelated set of activities which will transform inputs to outputs. And then the stakeholders are one of the major part of this asset management itself, because a person or a group who is affected by these decisions. So any type of the policies or the different types of methods you do, that's going to have a stakeholder influence, which is why it's very important when you look at this asset management in a big picture. And the last two things, one is a strategic asset management plan, which is a document management plan that provides how organizations' objectives are converted into management objectives. So which is a very, very key piece in this asset management, because you need to ensure that your assets, functions, or the outputs are in alignment with the overall organization objective. So you need to make sure there's a strong alignment between these assets to the organizational objectives so that you get the best out of your assets. And the top management is a group of individuals who directs and controls. As I mentioned before, without a proper enforcement or authority, one cannot implement and run the system. So that's vital. So going back to these three things, what I highlighted here on the screen, which is one is the critical assets, the predictive action, and preventive action, are the areas where Grace engineered products plays in these areas, where it gives some level of predictive abilities through some of the products, which we will talk late in the webinar. Okay, later in the webinar. Let's go to the next slide. So this one is basically asset lifecycle stages with the different variations. So on the top, what you see is identify the need. If you look at the common factors here, identifying the need is common, and then you need to either create or design or select. So those are the common thing as well. So the reason why I highlighted the three things here, design, purchase, install, and configure, and operate and maintain, are the common factors that goes with any type of the asset lifecycle stage, right? Either you need to design by yourself, or you need to acquire it or procure it somebody, or you need to install and configure, and last but not least, operate and maintain is one of the common themes across any type of the life cycle stages. And last one, I think most companies don't pay much attention to is the disposal cost, right? Not only you use the assets to the best of their ability and the design criteria, but also you need to make sure that these devices are disposed properly for few reasons. One is environmental criteria, and the second thing is you get the best salvage value out of that assets as well. So asset management definition, this is from Institute of Asset Management Professionals. So it is basically a systematic and coordinated practice through which an organization optimally and sustainably manages assets and the asset system and their associated performance, risk, and expenditure over life cycle for the purpose of achieving its organizational strategic plan. So if you look at these highlighted items, it is not something that's done in a trial and error method. It's more like a systematic and coordinated practice. That's why it's called a management principle or a plan, where you have a systematic approach and a policies and procedures in place. And then the second one is optimally and sustainably. So you need to make sure it gives the best value for the buck you're investing, and also it's done in more sustainable fashion, right? And the next one is the performance, risk, and expenditure over the life cycle. You need to make sure your cost, risk, and the performance are balanced to get the optimal output. And lastly, the strategic plan, it needs to align with your overall organizational objective for what you are mission to do. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Here we talk about the asset management. So the reason why I highlighted activities here is most of the time we focus, as many facilities we focus, activities only, primarily on the activities, but in reality activities comes in the last. But we try to put that in the first place. So and the second thing is we do the decisions by aligning the purpose of the organization with the asset, right? So, and also you need to make sure the decisions are made at the top level. Then you have the definitive plans, and then that's followed by the activities, what needs to be done. And again, it follows the risk-based management process similar to ISO 31000 standards, which does a plan, do, check, and act life cycle, which is more like an iterative process where you go and convert the organizational objectives into asset related. So X facility requires this output so that we have this asset Y that needs to put this throughput, need to perform and so on, so efficiency, and we try to get this live for the specific asset itself, okay? So what does asset management really do? So it examines the need for an asset. As I mentioned, you need to go back to the very initial phase where you identify the need, whether you need this asset, right? And then what is the performance criteria of that asset it needs to put out? And then goes from the managing asset at different stages, from conception through disposal, as I talked about in the life cycle stage. And lastly, then you manage the post-disposal liabilities, right? Environmental liabilities or any cost liabilities that's associated, you need to manage to that effect as well, okay? So when we look at the asset management approach, I call it a shift in thinking. You basically go from a silos to a system level thinking, right? So if you look at this 4 items here on this slide, one is the maintenance. So the maintenance teams are always tasked with, okay, what is my maintenance spend? How much I'm spending the monies on my equipment, right? So how frequent I'm performing the maintenance tasks related to all this equipment. And if you look at the operational excellence, they have a different metrics. Their metrics are basically what's my throughput and do I have accidents or am I selling this product and so on so level or not. And then the last 2 are pretty interesting. One is the capex, which is a capital expenditure, and one is the operational expenditure. So these again, interestingly, work in their own silos, right? The people who are making the decisions while designing these projects are trying to take only what is the initial investment into consideration. They're not taking enough call on what is the operational expenditure needs are. So when you look at this, it is a bigger thing that people need to consider because the total cost of ownership takes into account both the initial costs and also the operational costs. Sometimes your initial cost could be less, but you would go pretty way beyond your operational expense. At the end, your overall cost of ownership is pretty high. So there should be a good discussion that needs to come in between when the systems are designed in the initial stage before you even acquire or design the systems, to make sure that everyone is aligned on those concepts so they understand, okay, I'm spending X amount of dollar on this initially. However, my operational costs are going to be significantly high. So I need to readjust my CapEx budgets to make sure that I spend reasonable amount so that my total cost is what is really, really identified and optimized at the time, right? So in these definitions, asset management is more like a program function. When you look at this, things work in a silos, right? So people are operating at the managerial level and with executive support. A program, as you look at this 4, is more like a time and scope limiter. And this can be established and maintained at a manager, right? A production supervisor or a maintenance manager or a person who is making this engineering decisions. They're kind of making this on their silos. But a management system, when we call this asset management, it must be initiated at the executive level, right? The difference is many organizations choose programmatic approach primarily because it's all metrics, metrics, metrics. We all get so swarmed with the metrics. I need to show how I'm doing as a department alone. But when you go outside that boundary and try to show what we're doing together as an organization as a whole, right, we'll think in a big picture. And lastly, the continual improvement is a foundation, right? So after doing all these things, you need to make sure that you're doing a continuous improvement, which is foundation for any level of system level approach. So the primary takeaway from this slide is basically you need to get out from this silo thinking and then look at more like a big picture level on a systems level. That's the only way this asset management will help you to do a better job, okay? So let's look at what are some of the fundamentals of the asset management, right? So these are the 4 fundamental elements when we talk about the assets. So first and foremost thing, value. So every asset has an actual or a potential value to organization. That's very clear. The 2 approaches to conceptualizing this value. So one is the value chain and the other one is the value stream, which is more like a set of activities which is combined to provide a value to the organization. So value stream on one hand focuses on lean concepts, so focus on the customer, whereas the value chain is more like a strategic concept where you focus on the competitive advantage. So focus of the value chain is more like you are doing a value proposition as a whole. So again, people ask this question, so what does that real value mean? So that depends. So the value of the asset depends on two things. One is its nature and the purpose to organization. And then the second thing is its needs and expectations of the stakeholder, right? So one is I have this X equipment installed in this facility that is supposed to do three functions, right? That's one piece. And the second thing is the needs and expectation of the stakeholders, which is more like the second thing, which is primarily what are these maintenance activities needs to be and what those expectations of how often they need to do this. That's the second thing, right? So the next one is assets exist to provide a value, as I mentioned, to organization and the stakeholders. And the second one is alignment. So alignment is a clear connectivity between the asset and the organization's objectives. So it gives a visibility and the purpose of the work that's being done by that specific asset. So it translates the objectives more so into technical, financial plans and activities. And the third one is pretty tricky one. So leadership. So leadership and workplace culture are determinants to realizing the value of the assets. So without the strong leadership and without having that culture within the organization, you can't enforce anything. You can't make anything happen, right? So leadership commitment, I would like to definitely emphasize, is very critical with asset management to establish, operate, or improve the asset management in organization, more from the senior executives to the supervisors. And the last one is the assurance piece, which is more like the asset management provides the assurance that X asset provides Y value as per the design criteria or its mission, right? So when you talk about the assurance, it's evaluated at several levels. One is through uptime or availability, which is more like a reliability function. The one it's more like a maintenance teams, which looks at more like a cost. And also the operational excellence or the production teams look at the throughput or the output. So once we look at this, you need to make sure you have these four fundamental elements whenever you try to implement this asset management systems in place. You need to have the balancing act and need to have all these four things clearly defined. Okay. So this slide, the graphic is taken from the ISO 55000 standards, which shows a relationship between the key terms as we talked. So asset portfolio is basically the different types of assets that sits within the organization. That's the lower level, right? And then the asset management, which provides the improved risk control and gives assurance how the asset management objectives will be achieved on a consistent basis, right? So on the next layer is asset management, which is more like the policies and procedures and how it's realizing the value from the assets and it's connected to the organizational objective as well. And the one thing which the ISO 55000 doesn't talk on this specific slide is about the leadership, culture, and motivation, right? So one thing which we talked about is outside this asset management graphic, what I'm showing here. So you need to have the leadership, the cultural factor, the motivation factor, and the behavior changes to have an impact on the overall asset management system, okay? Let's go and take a look at asset management transition model. So this is again taken from 55,000 standards and also the Institute of Asset Management Professionals. As you look through the bottom of this pyramid, you manage individual assets over time, correct? So basically you optimize the lifecycle activities in the bottom layer, which is the lifecycle activities. And the second layer is manage asset systems or the networks. So which is more like a sustained performance of what exactly the assets do. And the third layer is basically capital investment optimization. So what is my return on investment? What's my return on assets? People use different calculations to come out with this, but 55,000 has few definitive guidelines on how to go with that. So that could be area. So if you look at bottom four, those are basically 55,000 asset management system pieces. Once the one on the top, which is more like a corporate or organization management, this is primarily where you need the leadership, your motivation, and you have the complete buy-in from all the stakeholders to ensure things are implemented in the way it's supposed to. So just want to make sure that leadership and culture, motivation, and all these things sits on top layer above all this, right? This is kind of a pyramid which shows the transition model. So as a facility owner or an operator, we need to go and look at which layer of this pyramid are you in. So you'll be doing something at different stages. Maybe some customers or some of our users are managing the asset portfolios, right? Somebody are still in the base level of managing the assets only because they don't have time to do any of those policies or procedures and also look at the complete return on investment or the calculations. They're more like ad hoc basis. I need to put out the fires. Let me do these things in the most efficient way as possible with the resources what I have on hand. Okay. So the next one is asset management strategy. When you look at implementing this, so the next one is you take all these pieces and how do you start this? How do you implement this? First and foremost thing is you need to define what the organization intends to achieve from the asset management activities, right? You need to have a clear objectives. Primarily, that's on the organizational objectives, and you need to bring alignment to ensure that they are aligned with the asset management objectives as well. And you need to have a definitive timeline. So you need to have smart objectives, as most of you know, to make sure those are attainable, measurable, and tracked, right? Next one is this document also a relationship between the asset management and the overall organizational objectives. And third, you define the framework to achieve the asset management objective as well. So framework in the sense you need to make sure you have a plan, which we'll talk about in the next slide, okay? So directional shift with ISO 55000. So it's more like going from a tactical element to a strategic piece, right? As we talked about, we looked at the individual phases or the life cycles instead of looking at them as an individual spends or the individual cost centers. You look at it on a full life cycle, which is more like a total cost of ownership and how do you look at it, right? And the next one is individual asset to asset systems and system of systems. As I mentioned, you look at the individual assets and then you look at the overall function of the combined set of assets as well. That's what we call systems of systems. And you go from a program management approach to more like a management systems approach. So you don't look at the individual silos, you look at the big picture and make those decisions. That's why primarily people or the organizations go from a tactical approach to a strategic approach. It gives that framework and it also gives organizations to have a complete line of sight as well. Okay, so this is a huge chart. This is kind of a framework what I was talking about for the asset management system. As you look at the top of this image, it's where the stakeholder organizational context, where you go and define the context of what those plans and organizational objectives are, and then that goes to the next level, which gives a strategic asset management plan where you try to bring the alignment with organizational objectives to the assets, and then you develop the asset management plans and then the implementation. So the interesting fact here is, as we look at it, the bottom one, the red circle highlighted here, is where most of the work is done, right? We get too much wound up on this last piece of monitoring, measurement, analysis without going to the next two levels and understanding the main premise of these things. So if you want to implement an asset management framework, there's more of planning required, right? So that's why I highlighted the planning to achieve the asset management objectives and outsourcing. So if you don't have right people or resources in place, you need to make sure that you bring in the asset managers, so the people who are certified asset managers from IMA, and they will come and do analysis and evaluation of your management systems, and they will basically give you, here is a report, here is your maturity model, here is where the organization sits, and here are the next development steps based on what you want to accomplish. And then you go from there. And also you look at the right corner here, the asset management system, those are the plans for developing the asset management system and also the relevant support. So these two are the main pillars when you're trying to implement the ISO 55000. And last but not least, you still need to have the management support and the buy-in. And if you look at this last dotted blue line here, that goes again, right? The feedback loop, we call it the continuous improvement. Anything that you learn from this performance evaluation improvement, that has to go back to each step within this framework. You need to make sure these things are going back and getting this inputs into those areas, so that when the revisions or when the next change cycle happens, you go and make those changes to your management plans and act accordingly. Okay. So in this, we also talk about what will be done, what resources will be required, and who will be responsible for what different tasks, and also lastly, how the results are evaluated as well. You need to have a definitive evaluation system in place before you go and measure any of these metrics, right? So the lastly, the risk management again is one of the key factors here. You need to make sure to identify the risks and opportunities. You have to understand and assess the risks and opportunities as well, and also implementation of the appropriate treatment and monitoring of the risks. So not only identify the risk, you need to have a good mitigation plan in place for these assets when you do this risk assessment process. Okay. So this is the interesting curve I found from Institute of Asset Management Professionals website. How do you optimize the frequency of planned maintenance? So planned maintenance activity is like the bottom level, as I mentioned. So this is also part of the asset management, but most organizations think when asset management is discussed, you're just maintaining. So which is not. Maintenance is a subset of the big picture of the asset management. So when you look at this curve, it clearly tells you the risk cost goes up as the equipment age, right? That's what is shown here on this red curve. And then on the direct cost, you're going to have a higher cost, like your installation, investments, while you're deploying and commissioning this equipment at a high at the initial period, but it will go down over a period of time. So the point here is your economic optimum is at a point where your total business impact is minimum. That's what is highlighted with this yellow line, right? So that's where you need to maintain you're performing your planned maintenance activities as they relate to the asset management. So you have the higher premium that you paid in the initial years to get your reliability targets, and then you have the premium paid for meet the cost targets, which is more like going towards the end of the cycle or after 3 to 4 years timeline as you look at this point where you perform the maintenance activities, because that's what most manufacturers recommend, the scheduled maintenance as well. And then from here, it's more like a straight curve, right? So it goes down. Your maintenance costs, your direct costs will go down as you maintain. But you need to make sure that you perform this maintenance at the optimal point so that your total business impact is not skyrocketing. You need to always keep watch on the total business impact when you look at this curve, while trying to either minimize the cost of maintenance activities. You need to ensure that your risk costs are kept in control. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So this is more like a performance measurement for assets and asset management system. So this is one interesting slide because it has the two things. So one is it shows the leading performance indicators. The second one is the lagging performance indicators. So leading performance indicators are more like your proactive monitoring. When I talk about condition monitoring or a predictive maintenance efforts, it's more like a proactive monitoring where you're monitoring the asset condition on a regular basis, and then you're driving your maintenance activities based off of that. Whereas the lagging indicators are basically, hey, the equipment shut down like once in 5 times in the last 3 months, or I have this so many incidents. Those are your reactive monitoring, right? So you need to understand which assets falls in what buckets. So the reason I put this on the slide is primarily as organization, when you're trying to implement these asset management systems, you need to go and evaluate the assets based on the type of approach you would like to put, right? So what type of the performance measurement metric, or how you want to monitor these assets based on its criticality, going back to my earlier slide where I talked about you need to understand the criticality of the asset before you put them on any of these two buckets. And then lastly, when you take this out, so output from this is management review, continuous improvement, and then feeds into the management systems and assets. So again, it's an iterative process where you learn the lessons from these maintenance activities, and then you go and feed the information so that you do a better job going forward. Okay, so One key points here is manage the physical assets in particular can also be applied to the other assets. And this method is not used for financial accounting and technical guidance for managing the specific types of assets. It will show you the balance between the cost, risk, and performance, realizing the value of the asset. And lastly, it gives the effective control and governance mechanism in place for organizations, which is essential to realize the value by effectively managing the risk and the opportunity as well. Okay, so let's look at this slide. What are some of the benefits of the asset management? We talked about the asset management framework. We talked about the different types of maintenance tasks that can be performed. So what is the end goal of asset management itself? So it improves the business performance. It will improve the return on investments and reduce the costs. And also it preserves the asset value, right? You need to make sure that the assets are preserved in its original condition to extend the design operational life, which gives both to short or long-term realization of the organizational objectives. And the second one is improved asset investment decisions. So enabling the organizations to improve its decisions effectively by balancing the costs, risks, and opportunities, and also the performance. And the managed risk. Managed risk in the sense it reduces the financial losses, it improves the health and safety of the employees, and also, last but not least, it will also improve the goodwill and the reputation of the organization as a whole in front of the customers. And further, it will minimize the environmental and social impact as well. And the improved services and output. What does that do? It gives assurance that the performance of the assets can lead to improved services or the products. And then it also shows the demonstrated social responsibility by increasing organizations' ability to reduce emissions and also the conserve resources to adapt to the climate change and others. And the last one is a demonstrated compliance, which is more like transparently conforming with the legal and statutory, right? So once you have the systems in place, not only you are meeting your bottom line, but also you are also meeting subconsciously your codes and standards requirements. So if there is any kind of audits done by external third parties for business evaluation, you have complete documentation to show that your assets are managed in the way they're supposed to, right? And also it leads to enhanced reputation. And lastly, improved efficiency, which is like the most important thing. What the most organizations will try to accomplish is improving the efficiencies and the effectiveness as well as they try to put these things, right? Let's go to the next slide. So what type of a different industrial assets this can be applied to? So Grace Engineered Products works in mostly industrial space. So I'm just showing a few pictures of the motors and pumps application, transformers, switchgear, and power generators. So these are most of electromechanical equipment where you can apply this asset management techniques or the 55,000 practice in place. So you can have the detailed list of the assets and you can see how these assets are performing to their mission functions or the design criteria, right? So I'd like to take a quick look at how we can help from the GraceSense or the Grace Engineered Products in providing some of those, right? So we talked about the critical failures or the critical elements when you look at the importance of the maintenance tasks. We also talked about the preventive and the predictive tools that you can use, right? So these are some of the list of products, what we do here at Grace to meet those requirements. So first thing you see on the left is the hotspot monitor, which is a temperature monitoring solution, which you can monitor mostly the bus bar temperatures and loose connections in a switch gear or a motor control center to ensure that systems are performing. This is more like a proactive measure. So everything what I'm showing here, if you go back to the earlier slides, right? So this all falls under proactive monitoring approach where you monitor the asset condition and then which are more like a leading indicators, right? So use of GraceSense products, what I'm showing here, you can do the leading indicators, you can verify this before the systems collapse or anomaly is detected, it gives a notification. The next one, what you see on screen is a vibration sensor that could be applied on more so on your rotating machinery, like for example, motors and pumps or generators or compressors and such, so that you monitor the vibration data and then you take these parameters and you can perform or plan for the maintenance activities accordingly. And the next one is a panel mount node, which kind of gives you an interaction between these devices and other parameters of the same asset. A good example would be a compressor is connected to a machine panel, for instance. So you're monitoring the temperature using a vibration data capture using a field mount node, and then at the panel mount node, you can monitor the other parameters like the voltage, frequencies, any other temperature thresholds, or RTDs for that matter, or the current draw. So the biggest advantage here is you're not only monitoring one measurement, you're monitoring the multiple measurements of that same asset. That gives you a complete visibility on the dashboard where you can send the triggers or the alerts to your maintenance personnel or the supervisors so they can take a corrective action before the failures happen. Okay. So this is the predictive maintenance. One of the tools is a vibration sensor, which is a field mount node that has a 3-axis accelerometer and a surface temperature monitor. The battery operated technology with a 5+ years of life. And we can do both in a wireless range of 30 meters, and over there updates, it connects to a cloud gate and then transmits the data to a remote cloud using an on-prem or cloud premise on cloud as well. Okay. And the next one is a panel mount node. As I mentioned, one is a wireless option, and the other one is the Wi-Fi option. One is with a LTE, other one is a Wi-Fi, what I'm showing here. So if you don't have an option to host all the data because of your IT department coordination, you can use this to remotely push the data using an LTE. Or if you have Wi-Fi access, you want to host the data internally, you can use it as well using a Wi-Fi. Okay. So this is one of the tools what we do here at Grace. Call it a maintenance hub now. It's not a decision workshop where you can group these assets. So we talked about the asset management system. So this, or again, at the low level within the asset management, this is more like a tactics, right? The tactical steps after you define all this management systems and the policies and procedures, you have these dashboards which will give you enough insights about what's going on with this equipment so that you can improve the value of the asset and ensure that you perform these maintenance functions on a timely manner before the systems fail as a whole. Okay. So bottom line, who wants asset management, right? So whenever you try to talk about any new concept or a new standard implementation, the first thing comes into place: why use it? What's going to benefit? The board of directors is the first target audience who will use it as a tool for accountability, right? So they will make sure that you have a return on these assets, and the ROI is justified for them to make sure that you're using the assets to the maximum extent possible. And the CEOs of your company, right, if you're trying to sell this to your CEOs, it could give them a resolve conflict solutions, right? There is the resources are divided between different projects or different assets. This gives them where the max value of that asset is realized, so these assets are deployed accordingly. And it also provides an integration performance tool for someone to measure the metrics on throughput or the overall performance as well, right? And then the CFOs will look at as a risk reduction tool, and also it will help in the M&As mostly when they try to buy an organization from others. They will look at all this asset management data, and then they'll be able to make those decisions accordingly. And lastly, asset management managers, who are the ones who are working on this assets, they will see it as a tool to improve their influence and budget, right? So if they know exactly what's going on with these assets, that will greatly enable them to provide the data insights to their management to get their budgets approved and so forth. And the operation maintenance folks use it to improve the working conditions and job satisfactions. So we call it specifically the working conditions, because when you manage these assets properly based on the risk management criteria and also defining what those safety and other guidelines are, you are ensuring that your work conditions are improved. So by improving the work conditions, automatically improve the job satisfaction of your employees as well. Okay. So in summary, why implement any of the standards, right? So some think implementing a system is always a burden, right? So, and for some, it gets in the way of work. So I don't have time. It's a great system, great methodology. I would like to implement the standards, but I don't have the time or the resources. The implementing standards provide three things. One is It provides the alignment of the purpose. It aligns the organizational objectives with what the result you're trying to get out from your assets or the performance of your assets. And the second one is performing the functions in a consistent manner. Using asset management systems, you are not only managing the assets based on your plans, you're also performing those functions in a more consistent manner that gives you the data over a period of time. And lastly, when you take the system level approach, you get out from the silos. You have a higher visibility through all levels of the organization. With asset management, now you have the visibility from the maintenance worker to a maintenance supervisor to a production manager to a reliability engineer, all have a big picture where they will see the information that pertains to that asset itself. And as with any other systems, right? So ISO 9001 has this quality management system. The 14001 has an environmental management system. And also 31,000, as we talked about, is the risk management, right? So how do you know whenever after implementing any of this, how do we know what you are doing is correct, right? So one, you don't have the resources to perform the initial audits or perform the regular audits to ensure that what's being done or things are being done correctly. So only through independent evaluation or by a third-party auditor, which are more like certified asset assessors, certified by IMA, they will come and they will help you guys out with the gap analysis with an open mind. I mean, when we call this, we call it the gap analysis has to be performed with an open mind for a self-reflection. So the biggest thing, that's a joke, as I mentioned, as humans, you always want to see what we believe is correct, right? So that's the biggest thing. So whenever you do the audits, go with an open mind and make sure that you want to take that feedback and understand those gaps for you to do a better job with your assets in the future. With that, I will open up for questions. Again, please make sure that you take this exit survey as you exit the webinar. And we also have the handouts of GraceSense IIoT solutions for the predictive maintenance. And see if you're interested in the product demonstration or how we can help you to manage your assets better. Okay, so you can type in your questions in the question pane, and I can definitely look at it and I can answer those questions for you.